Hello, my name is Marlene Theodore. I'm the Associate Curator of Programs in the Education Department at the Yale University Art Gallery. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this program, Rediscovering François Gérard, generously sponsored by the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund. About a year ago, my colleague Ian McClure, the Susan Morse Hillis Chief Conservator at the Gallery, let me know of a scholar by the name of Kathy Galitz, who had conducted incredibly interesting research on a painting at the gallery, and who had collaborated with Ian and our colleague, the gallery's chief curator, Larry Cantor. Kathy's research, which had recently been published in the Burlington magazine, is both historical and technical. It involves art history, museum education, curatorial, and conservation, and it reads as a kind of detective story. This research centers on a portrait of Émilie Brugnard by the artist François Gérard, and that portrait is the subject of this program. Kathy Galitz is a scholar of late 18th and early 19th century French art. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Kathy has organized several international exhibitions. She's a frequent lecturer across museums, and she's authored the book Masterpiece Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of 2016, as well as numerous essays on neoclassical painting. Kathy is also quite patient. This program was originally scheduled for April, some 7 months ago. I'm delighted that at last we can present this program. We will first hear from Ian, who will offer an introduction to this story. Kathy will share some of her research, and then Ian and Kathy will look at the painting together. And we hope that their conversation will be guided by your questions. You are invited to submit questions via the Q&A panel that you can see along the bottom of your Zoom screen. So thank you, Ian and Kathy. Special thanks to my colleagues, Jake Gagne and Liz Harnett, who help make virtual programs happen. And thanks to all of you for joining us. So now I will turn this over to Ian McClure and Kathy Galitz.
Thanks very much, Nadine. I first was acquainted with this painting in 2010 when Larry Cantor, who's the chief curator and curator of European art, bought it for our collection. And we were all struck by the beauty of this particular painting. A little later in 2016, Kathy contacted me because she was interested in the painting, as it's a reappearance. The painting was known about, but this was a reappearance of the painting. So she came up to New Haven from the Met, and we were able to look at the painting together. We were able to take X-rays and do infrared imaging. And out of that research and her further research, which she will tell you about in a moment, became this whole story and how our painting was very much more interesting than we first thought. And Kathy, so would you like to take the story further?
Yes, thank you so much, Ian. And Marlene, thank you for the generous introduction. And definitely this proves that patience is a virtue and it does pay off, because I'm just thrilled to be here today and very grateful to you, Ian, and also Larry Cantor for your very generous support of my research. I first encountered Gérard's portrait of Alexandrine Émilie Brugnard just not long after Yale had acquired the painting. And I was absolutely thrilled. And I was thrilled because, in fact, I had been researching Gérard's early portraits at the time, and to learn that this portrait had suddenly reappeared, having been thought lost since the 19th century, was pretty exciting. And it was even more exciting because this was the first portrait that Gérard exhibited publicly at the Paris Salon in 1795. The portrait of 15-year-old Émilie, as she was known, as I said, was his first exhibited portrait, and it also launched a career as a portraitist that would span decades for Gérard. And in his time, he was really a big deal. And I say that because I suspect his name is not quite a household name today. But just to give you a sense, a little bit of the who's who that flocked to Gérard to have their portraits painted, well, here he is, first of all. And you can see him as a young artist at 20, where he was studying in the studio of Jacques-Louis David. And David was the leading history painter of the day. His style defined neoclassicism in the 1780s and 1790s. And here we see him in an intimate friendship portrait painted by Gros in 1790. And this was actually a little before he would go on to paint Madame Bonaparte, Josephine Bonaparte, seen here in 1801, posing in a setting evocative of her Chateau Malmaison. And this was while her husband was busy consolidating his rise to power. And at the time he was first consul. He also would go on to paint Juliette Récamier, a very fashionable salon hostess, seen here in a painting from 1805. And again, you may not know who Juliette Récamier is today, but you may well know her more celebrated portrait, unfinished portrait at the Louvre, painted by David in 1800. And literally, when Juliette Récamier set foot outside her home, it was newsworthy in early 19th century Paris. So these were major coups for a young portrait painter to be asked to paint people like this. But that said, what Gérard really wanted was not success as a portraitist. He wanted to be a history painter like his master, David. And we see here David's celebrated portrait, the lictors returning, celebrated history painting rather, the lictors returning to Brutus, the bodies of his son, a very gruesome topic, painted in 1789. And for this portrait, Gérard was asked to assist David in the painting of it. And you might think, oh, that's an onerous task. And in fact, it was actually an honor to be asked by David to assist with one of his portraits. And it was a pretty competitive thing too in David's studio at the time, because there was a lot of talent. And Gérard was one among a constellation of very talented artists who were vying for his master's favor. And Gérard, as I said, really wanted to follow in David's footsteps and become a successful history painter. So he made his debut at the Salon just a few years later in 1793 with a history painting that really went virtually unnoticed by any critic at the Salon, which is not a good thing. But in 1795, he had more success with this history painting of the blind Byzantine general Belisarius. And this work is known to us today only by this reduced scale replica, which Gérard painted a few years later. And at the time that it was painted, it was lauded for its naturalism and praised. But this was not, and one thing, this was a painting that David had painted about 15 years earlier, also to great acclaim. So this says something about who Gérard was and his ambitions as a painter, that he wasn't afraid to take on a subject that his own teacher had painted, but to show that he would sort of go head to head with him, if you will, at the Salon. And it paid off, because a few years after this was painted, it was named one of the most beautiful history paintings in France, and Gérard deemed a successful history painter. But at the same time, he also had another work on view at the Salon in 1795. And it was this portrait of 15-year-old Émilie Bonniard, whose father was a celebrated Parisian architect. Critics at the time unanimously praised this work for its lifelike quality. And I'll just share one excerpt from the writer for the McClure de France, who speculated rather suggestively that Gérard's subject would, quote, "She will blush if you look at her with too interested an eye." Salon commentators were especially taken by the naturalism of the figure, and they went so far as to compare Gérard's portrait to Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Now, at the time, the Mona Lisa was actually on display at Versailles, so it would have been well known both to Gérard and also to the critics and to Salon audiences. We see Émilie here holding in her right hand a porte-crayon, which is a metal holder for a drawing instrument like a pencil or a crayon. And this was in fact because young Émilie herself was an artist. She was taking drawing lessons, including a few lessons with none other than David himself. And in fact, it may have been David who introduced his young student Gérard to the Bonniard family. And this is actually, you probably all noticed, not a painting, but rather an engraving after the painting. And this engraving was made later in the 19th century. But now I want to fast forward from 1795 to 2010. This painting appeared at auction, the painting now at Yale. And at the time that this work was rediscovered and revealed, it was thought that in fact this was all that remained of the 1795 portrait, and that for some unknown reason, late in the 19th century, that the 3/4 length portrait had been cut down to this bust. So you can imagine my surprise when in 2016, the existence of a second portrait of Emily I became aware of. Now, the portrait of Emily on the right, just like the one at Yale, had been passed down in a family of the sitter. So there was no reason to question the attribution of either work. But other questions remain to be answered. First, why were there two similar portraits of Emily? And what was the relationship between? This is where I needed help and benefited greatly from the work of Ian McClure. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ian, to pick up the story.
Right. Well, before we discuss the two portraits in more detail, looking at them with X-rays, I'd like to just show a slide. If we could show the next slide of. Could we show the next slide, Kathy? Yes. I want to just show you a slide of a painting, also in the gallery's collection, which is of Hubert Robert's The Old Bridge. He was a famous artist in the first half of the 18th century, who has painted these fantastic architectural scenes. But when we X-rayed this painting as part of the examination, when we came to the lab for cleaning, we discovered with the X-rays quite by chance that when you turn the painting up on its end and stand it on its right vertical side, you can see that there's something completely different underneath. There's a figure of a woman, a half-length figure of a woman, who seems to be either washing her hair with a cloth or wringing out a cloth. And of course, Hubert Robert populated his great architectural scenes with scenes of washerwomen and small figures doing various things by the streams that he would paint. You can see, in fact, to just orientate you, you can see in the lower left corner of the painting, as it appears today, the small figures standing there, and you can now see them in the X-ray, as it were, standing on their sides up in the top left side. The reason why we can see this is because the figure underneath is painted principally in lead white paint. The lead paint has been used for the highlights of the flesh and also for the highlights of the drapery, which are very dramatically drawn on the lower right. And they show up because the lead white paint, just as when you go to the doctor for an X-ray, the technician wears a lead apron, the lead white paint absorbs the X-rays, and so in the image it shows up as white in this particular image. So if you look at the next slide, can we have the next slide, please?
I did. I think there's a bit of a delay. I'm sorry.
Okay, so if we look at the next slide, this is the X-ray image of our portrait of Madame Brunier, and you can see that in fact the same sort of thing applies, but much more subtly. So for example, if we look at the next slide, you can see on her sleeve, for example, the highlights of her sleeve are painted in lead white, and you can see they show up quite clearly in the X-ray. This is a detail just of that corner. But when we look, for example, if you remember in the portrait that Kathy discovered in Paris, Emily is holding a porte crayon, this little metal tube which you could insert a charcoal or chalk into. Because it's made of metal and it's catching the light, it has little highlights, if you remember, in the image. So if we look at the next image, you can see we would be expecting to see little vertical strokes of those highlights in lead white in our X-ray, but we can't see anything at all. This is the bottom corner X-ray of our painting. And you can also see, for example, that it has been treated since it was painted. It's had new tacking edges, new edges attached to it, and the painting is now held onto its wooden stretcher rather than by tacks, which would be the traditional way. It's now stapled on. So those little sort of U-shaped objects are the staples, which are, because they're made of steel, are showing up quite clearly in the X-ray. But you can't see any evidence of the porte crayon at all. So if we look at the slide again, next slide. And here you can see where we'd expect to see the port crayon, and you can see the little highlights just above her thumb. They're not visible at all. So this was a great puzzle because there's no sign of the painting being cleaned or damaged or any sign of elements of the painting being removed. And this was confirmed again by an infrared image, which is the next slide. And this is a slightly different way of looking at paintings, where the infrared image is where the infrared energy penetrates a little bit below the surface of the painting. And what it shows up, it tends to show up anything very clearly that's painted with anything that's involving carbon. So it could be a charcoal drawing, it could be paint with some black paint in it made from carbon or from charcoal. And here, I think what you can see is that the background, it's showing much more clearly the background to the gallery's portrait. And what I think you can see very clearly in the infrared image is this horizontal line running across just above Emily's neck, and then this curved shape just behind her neck on the left side of the picture. And when you look at the painted image, I think what you're actually seeing is she seems to be standing in front of a shelf, or perhaps a mantelpiece. And that the infrared image helps us to see that much more clearly. You can also see on the right side the outlining that he's done to really perfect the image, the outline of the image. You can see this dark line around the front of her dress, and also the slight modifications to the outline of the face as well. You can also see up in her forehead, where her hair on the right he painted in more details, which he then edited out in the painted image. You can see just below, you can see the lock coming down, but there's also this space, this triangular space that he has in the painting, which was filled with hair in the infrared. And if we look at the next slide, we can also see, when we look more closely, we can see little outlines for example, her left eye, drawing the pupil, and also the slight modification between her eyebrow and the top of the eye socket. And also in her mouth, you can see the line he painted to between her two lips, just to get the exact line there as well. So all this suggests that there's quite a lot of modification done to this portrait, and also the background in this painting is quite different to the background in the larger version.
Thank you, Ian. It's always so wonderful. You help us see what we can't see, but what we want to know, what helps us to understand better what we are seeing. And that brings me back to the existence of this second portrait of Emily. And in fact, we know from Emily's letters, and she was a copious letter writer and keeper of a diary, as many 15-year-olds are. And she wrote to her brother in her diary that she, in fact, posed for her portrait in Gérard's studio. And she writes that Gérard painted the portraits, both of them, in about a month's time. In April 1795, she wrote that she posed for the portrait in Gérard's studio at the Louvre, and that this portrait was finished in 5 days. Then, on May 17th, 1795, she reported to her brother that she was back again in Gérard's studio, posing for another portrait. She wrote, "I have been working at the museum for the past 10 days, except for the last 4 days. Citizen Gérard was so dissatisfied with my portrait that he was determined to start again. However," she added, "it is very beautiful." Now, Gérard's renewed campaign on Emily's portrait reflects his ambitions for the work, and to my mind, his desire to make his mark at the Salon. Because at the Salon, this was really the only place an artist had to make or break his or her reputation. And in May 1795, at the time that Gérard was working on this portrait, he was struggling both professionally, he had yet to achieve that kind of recognition at the Salon, and also financially. So the stakes for Emily's portrait were high, and as of May 1795, he had only 5 months until the Salon was going to open at the Louvre. And a comparison of these two portraits reveals that the outline of the head and neck, as well as the placement of her facial features, are identical in both works, evidence that the artist used a tracing. But there is a key difference. In the larger portrait, which is painted on panel rather than canvas, take a look at the curl on the right side of her forehead, the same curl that we were looking at with Ian in the Yale canvas just a few minutes ago. Here, the curl falls in the opposite direction as that in the Yale portrait. And here I just want to show you a detail of that. And here's a detail on the left. And in a bravura touch, Gérard has also added the shadow that curl casts. But looking now at this image taken with an infrared camera, you can see visible drying cracks in the shadow, and these cracks reveal an isolated layer of dark paint that's visible just beneath the flesh tone, indicating a change in the outline of the curl. This change, made as Gérard worked, suggests that the Yale canvas was painted first, and that therefore the work on panel is based on a tracing made from the former. And here I have to thank not only Ian, but also conservator Alice Penard, who helped me analyze the 3/4 length portrait in private collection. But there's another subtle difference between the two portraits. And so bringing them back so that you can see them together again. In the second portrait, look at Emily's face. It's noticeably less rounded, and I would argue less childlike than the portrait on the left. She appears older, more like a young woman rather than a young girl. And this must have been a deliberate choice on Gérard's part as the work evolved. And indeed, her likeness in the larger portrait is more in keeping with the image of budding sexuality that so captured the imagination of salon reviewers when they looked at this portrait in 1795. As one commentator wrote, "As yet she desires nothing, but desire is not far away." When the salon opened its doors to the public in October 1795, it was the 3/4 length portrait of Emily that was on view. And we know this based on a description of the work in one of the salon reviews. And here, I can't resist sharing Emily's charming account of her visit to the salon to see her portrait on view, as once again, she wrote to her brother. And here she just sounds like a typical 15-year-old. She wrote, "I was done up as he painted me, and this was such a good likeness that everyone was looking at me and people pointed at me. The next day, it was a bit less, as I wore a hat. This painting is accepted as being the most beautiful, despite the fact that there are two very beautiful ones by Monsieur David, who says himself that mine is a masterpiece." Now, the two very beautiful portraits by David that Emily was referencing are this pair of portraits of the Cerizia family, husband on right, mother and child on left. And these portraits are extraordinary paintings by David, and like Gérard's work, show a new kind of sense of naturalism and relaxed informality in David's portraits. And you have to remember that this is painted just a few years after the French Revolution, after the Reign of Terror, which was a very bloody, turbulent, unstable time. So it's as if artists were looking for a kind of return to something a little more pleasant, shall we say. Now, Gérard's work also captivated other salon goers, not just Emily, and they too responded to the naturalism of the style of the portrait, this young girl on the cusp of womanhood. As someone wrote of Gérard's portrait, "The budding roses mixed with the lilies of her flesh announce the dawning of a life that adults are already embellishing." Now, the portrait also caught the eye of another young artist in David's studio at the time, and that artist was Jean-Dominique Auguste Ingres. And at the right, you can see a sketch that Ingres made of Emily's portrait. I think, having just seen it at the salon, it looks rapidly sketched, but nonetheless captures in virtually every detail Gérard's portrait. Now, that work clearly stuck in Ingres's mind because 11 years later, when he made his own debut at the Salon with this portrait of Mademoiselle Caroline Rivière, also 15 years old, you can see that Gérard's work remained etched in his memory. Its 3/4 length format and even her pose subtly echo Gérard's portrait, which attests to Gérard's influence on Ingres's formation as a portraitist. And I'm not the first to make that observation. Already in 1967, when Robert Rosenblum was writing his definitive study on Ingres's portraits, he made the connection with some of Gérard's other portraits on Ingres's early portraits from the early 19th century, not just this particular pair, but there are others. But here, I hope you will indulge me as I'm going to make a link from Gérard by way of Ingres to Robert Wilson in 2013. And this is Robert Wilson's video portrait of Lady Gaga, who is embodying Ingres's adolescent sitter, who tragically died the same year that Ingres had painted her. Now, if you're curious about Wilson's video portrait, you can just Google it. You'll find it online. It's about 6 minutes long. And I'm not going to tell you what happens in the video. You have to watch it. But back to Gérard. His portrait of Emily also resonated in his own body of work. His history painting, Cupid and Psyche, which he began around the same time as Emily's portrait, was also garnered critical acclaim at the Salon in 1798. And a 19th century art critic said that the model for Psyche was none other than Émilie Poignard. And he described the figure of Psyche in suggestive language that echoed the response to Emily's portrait in 1795. He wrote, "It is clear that she does not yet have a woman's developed charms, although she promises them all." And look at the pose of Psyche as well, how she faces outward in a 3/4 view with her arms crossed just below her breasts in a gesture of modesty, very much mirrors that of Emily, perhaps even a deliberate echo on Gérard's part. Significantly, too, the artist's 19th century biographer explicitly linked these two works, and he called Emily's portrait a preface to that of Cupid and Psyche. With its rediscovery, Emily's portrait now can assume its rightful place at the forefront of works that Gérard painted before 1800 that heralded his successful career as a portraitist. The naturalism of Emily's portrait set the stage for this portrait of the painter Isabey and his daughter seen on the steps of the Louvre, which was a huge hit at the Salon of 1796. Critics compared this ambitious portrait to the aristocratic portraits of the 17th century Flemish master, Anthony van Dyck. And in the portraits, in Gérard's efforts to capture figures in motion, that's something that he would show an interest in later portraits as well. But we see for the first time here in the portrait of Isabey. Or another portrait from about the same period. Here, the elegant sitter and landscape background in this work, which was painted in 1799, prompted critics once again to call up Leonardo da Vinci's example, seeing clearly in this portrait a nod to none other than the Mona Lisa. So you can imagine, with all this good press that Gérard was getting by the close of the 18th century, it seemed inevitable that he would come into contact with the most prominent person in France circa 1800. And of course, that was none other than then first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. And here we see Bonaparte in a portrait that was likely painted from life in 1803. And in fact, it's one of the few instances where we know that a portrait of Napoleon was actually painted from life rather than some other image. But what's remarkable to me is how in 2 short years, both Gérard's style, but also the way that Napoleon publicly presented himself totally changed. Here, this is very intimate, considering that he's a general, and lifelike, but suddenly boom, 2 years later, you see, and Napoleon is emperor now, emperor of France. And he's like this frozen icon of imperial authority, which with, to my eyes, very little sense of kind of that humanity or the naturalism that we saw in his earlier portrayal by Gérard. To my eyes, there is a singularity to the portrait of Emily that sets it apart from Gérard's later works. And its rediscovery establishes its primacy both in Gérard's body of work and in the flourishing of portraiture in early 19th century France. But I can't conclude this talk without giving you a postscript to Emily herself, because of course she was only 15 when she posed for this portrait and had a long life ahead of her. And in fact, 5 years after she sat for this portrait, within weeks of her marriage to André Pichon, she and her new husband set sail for America, where her husband was sent as a representative of the French government in Washington, D.C. Having crossed the Atlantic, the couple landed in New York. And this would be the closest that Emily herself would get to New Haven. So New York, that's as close as she got. And they spent the next 5 years abroad. Luckily for us, Emily continued her practice of letter writing, and this period of her life is documented in letters that her family kept, and in fact were published earlier this year in France. So they bring this chapter of Emily's life vividly to life. And we know from her letters that she developed friendships with people like Dolly Madison and the family of Thomas Jefferson. And we also know that when she was sailing back from France in 1805 with her husband, that while at sea, she gave birth to her elder son, André Théodore. And this son later inherited this portrait of his mother, which remains in the possession of Emily's descendants today. And so that brings our story full circle. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. That was a really wonderful story. And I think it's, as Marlene said, it's a really good example of how a collaboration between colleagues, but also looking at technical information and the art historical research. And it was a great opportunity to do this. And I really enjoyed working with you. And it's quite rare to have such a wonderful conclusion to research. Often it's a little bit vague or not quite the proof that you need. But here we really felt that we discovered something quite important and made our painting so much more interesting, although it was already a very beautiful object. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian.
We have some time for some questions, and I can see if there's any questions, if you'd like to put them on the chat. I have some questions. There's one question which I couldn't help wondering about, where Kathy earlier on mentioned Gérard as citizen, and then of course nowadays we know him as the Baron Gérard, and I just wondered how all that happened.
Well, you have to, one has to remember that history was changing so rapidly in the 1790s into the early 19th century. At the time that he painted Emily's portrait in 1795, France was a new republic and everyone was either citizen, citoyen, or citoyenne, as was the case in 1795 when he painted Emily's portrait during the Directory. But then things rapidly changed. The Directory gave way to the consulate. Napoleon Bonaparte, as he was then, seized power in a coup d'etat in 1799. And then by December 1804, First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte was crowning himself Emperor of France. And 5 years later, Emperor Napoleon gave Gérard his title of Baron Gérard, which he retained obviously for the rest of his life. But at the time he painted Emily's portrait, he was simply a citizen.
Great. So I have a question here about the life of our portrait. It was also in Emily's family, wasn't it? The two versions were both in his family.
Yes, it was. Emily had two sons, and the three-quarter length portrait remained in the possession of her elder son and his descendants, whereas the bust length portrait was passed down from her younger son um, through his family. And then it subsequently appeared at auction from the descendants in 2010.
Great. And then we also have another question about the background that we can see, I think principally in the infrared image, that sort of horizontal line where part of it seems to be coming out of Emily's neck in our portraits, particularly in the infrared image. Yes, I was just wondering, to me it seems it looks like, possibly a shelf. The other thing I thought initially was it might be a scroll or something hanging, but the fact that it does suggest it might have been something that, could be seen when the portrait was painted perhaps in Gérard's studio. I don't know what you think, Kathy.
I think that I like your suggestion of a shelf. Thinking about this work in a studio setting, that would be something that would be a very plausible explanation to my eyes.
Yeah. The other question we've had as well is, you can't help noticing that, of course, Emily was dressed in a white dress, and in fact, every image of portraits of women, they all seem to be wearing white dresses. Was this something that was, a real fashion statement? It must have been quite difficult to wear a white dress in the 18th century.
Well, it was. And in fact, a lot of ink has been spilled on that topic as well, Ian. But if you think about it, it goes back to, well, revolution with Marie Antoinette wearing those muslin dresses when she was frolicking around Versailles, playing at being a shepherdess. But by the 1790s, wearing white dresses took on different connotations because the wearers, these women, were likened to Greek classical statuary, wearing these white dresses. So they were called, this fashion in French was called, dressing à la grecque, in the Greek style. And in fact, some people took it to extremes, and was quite scandalous because there were some critics who said, women looked like they were running around completely naked in these white dresses and that it was indecent. But as you can see, the way that Emily wears the white dress, it's very chaste. But interestingly, Josephine Bonaparte also cultivated this image wearing this white dress, which was very fashionable at the time. And she was what was known as a merveilleuse, these sort of fashionable society women who dressed in this way, as was Juliette Récamier, also seen clad in white. Now, for Juliette Récamier, the story gets a little spicier, if you will, because even though she was married and she wore this white dress, it was said that even after her marriage, she remained a virgin. And so that this white dress was somehow also symbolic of her chastity. But if you recall the image that Gérard painted of Juliette Récamier, to my eyes was anything but chaste and extremely suggestive. So this wearing of the white dress could go either way. It could be innocence, as I think it is with young Emily here, but also extremely provocative, as modeled by Juliette Récamier.
Sorry, following up on this question, appears not the shelf background on the X-ray image, but what appears at the back of her neck. Is that round curved shape? I think the question is referring to. I think that's the kind of, to me, it looks like it could be a bracket, holding up the shelf, or it could be a bracket of a mantelpiece or something like that in the infrared. And I think when you look really carefully at our portrait, it's just about visible. So hopefully when we can reopen the gallery and it's once more open to the public, it will be an opportunity to come and see the portrait in question. The other question was just following up on you mentioned the style of à la grecque, and the question was asking if this is connected to interest in discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum. I'm sure that must be the case.
Those discoveries actually were in the 1730s and 1740s, so that very much contributed to the larger movement of neoclassicism in style and painting in the sort of 1760s and beyond, but definitely goes back to the renewed interest in classical antiquity that was a phenomenon of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, very much so. And even her hairstyle, if you look at Emily's hairstyle and the way she's wearing her hair, if you next time you see any Greek or Roman statues, you might look at the women in their hairstyles. It's actually quite similar to a Greek or Roman statue.
Thanks very much.
Ian, I have a question for you based on my fascination with what conservators do. Could you just share a little bit about the X-ray technique and the infrared technique and how it's done in a conservation lab versus when we go to our doctors and get an X-ray, for example?
Well, the X-rays system that we use, I should say in the past, the system that we used was we had special film, which was extremely expensive to buy because it has a silver emulsion on it. And so because X-radiography was so expensive to do in the gallery setting, we'd have to be very, very specific about exactly why we wanted an X-ray a painting, which meant that these chance discoveries, like the Hubert-Robert painting I showed you with the figure underneath, were very unlikely to turn up, because unless you could actually see something and which gave you a hint there might be something underneath, you would tend not to do X-rays. But nowadays, the technology is, like so many things, has gone digital. And so the X-rays image is captured either on a special screen or by specially prepared plates, which you can reuse again and again. And then, so which means that once you bought the equipment, you can X-ray basically everything that comes past in the lab. And so we do make more discoveries, especially such as this. And what's interesting also is that in the portraits case, it was interesting, the X-ray didn't show us anything. And so sometimes you're a bit disappointed if you're doing an X-ray and nothing turns up. But in this case, the fact that we couldn't see anything really was the interesting answer. I think if we'd seen evidence of the port crayon, we would have been really puzzled then exactly what we were looking at. With the other technology, the infrared reflectography, it really relies on, well, there's two ways of doing it. Again, mainly due to the developments in digital technology. So, for example, if you buy a digital camera today, the sensor that captures the image has to be protected from infrared radiation, because the sensors are quite sensitive. And so in some cases, what you can do, we will send an ordinary SLR camera to a specialist who removes all the screens from us and promptly invalidates its guarantee. And then that is quite sensitive to infrared and will produce images which go a little bit into the infrared spectrum. And so will reveal a certain amount of information. But there's another technology which is really comes down to us from gun sights and night sights, which are very sensitive to infrared. And these have been adapted for art conservation, and they go a little bit further into the infrared. But the problem there, of course, is that the equipment itself is extremely expensive. And so we've been very fortunate here to being able to share our infrared camera that we use to show Madam the portrait with the British Art Centre and other collections at Yale. And this again, you capture with the image, the technology itself doesn't have particularly good resolution. So we have to take tiny details of the portrait, and we can do this, and we can use software to stitch all these tiny details together. So what we end up with is a kind of mosaic of the painting. So that's really the two things we used here. We could have gone on, perhaps if we'd been really, puzzled enough to do further research, we could have looked at the materials of the painting, and we could have analyzed the paintings. And we can use another type of X-ray energy today to scan the portrait. It's called X-ray fluorescence, where it can detect the elements in a painting. And that also can make a map of the different paints that the artist has used. And that is really a very recent discovery, well, a technology that's been adapted for art conservation. So I've got a couple more questions. So is there any plan to exhibit the portrait side by side in the future? Gosh, that would be such a wonderful thing. That we have to persuade, I think it would have to happen in the Yale Art Gallery, but of course there's always the slight risk with large panel paintings for travel, that they are more sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity. But again, modern methods of packing and transporting would get around that.
That would be a wonderful reunion.
Yeah, absolutely. And then this is another very interesting question here. So do you know for certain if the portraits were actually commissioned, or would this have been Gérard's gambit to get noticed at the salon? and does Emily say anything about being portrayed as an artist rather than just being a sort of pretty sort of picture or a pose?
Okay, I'll take that question in two parts. First, do we know if they were commissioned? I suspect, although that there's no documentation of the commission, Emily's father was a prominent architect, and Gérard was in the orbit of the Brongniart family. They were friends. Emily studied Italian with Gérard's wife. They had dinner at the Gérard's house. So there was a kind of closeness. So I'm not sure if money was actually exchanged, but I think it came out of that relationship, this portrait of young Emily. So that's question number one. Question number two, now I've blanked on what the question was. Was it commissioned, and what was the second part?
Was Emily?
Did she mention her own art and being shown as an artist? No, but here's the deal. What was published of her early and even her more recent letters to America, frustratingly incomplete and without footnotes. As a scholar, I would love to see the letters published, in full, dated, the letters in full, and then you could take with what you would from those letters. But unfortunately, the letters that detail this portrait were published in a family history of the Brongniart family that was published in the 1930s by a member of the family. So he clearly had access to these letters and was just pulling little snippets from them, whereas I would have loved to have seen the letters in full and seen other letters. There might have been more of interest, but despite efforts to track down those letters leading up to the publication of my article in 2016, I wasn't able to locate if in fact that cache of letters from Emily's early years still existed. So I don't know if she ever mentioned that she took pleasure in being shown as a young artiste or not, because it's not, I don't have those letters. I only have what was published from them.
Yes, and I think we know, again, this is following up with another question, that the portraits were in the family. And do we know anything about how they were displayed? Were they sort of, seen when you entered the house, or do we have any information at all?
I haven't come across any documentation of that, although I did imagine, I was thinking about Emily going to America for 5 years with her husband, and I imagine that her portrait would have stayed with her mother and father, because I couldn't imagine toting a sizable wood painting on panel across the Atlantic and back again, just to have it along with you for the ride. So I imagine that stayed in Paris.
Great. So I think, oh yes, and just somebody mentioning the Robert Wilson's video of Lady Gaga, which is another kind of collaboration. Actually, there's quite a few other videos of other paintings from the time that Lady Gaga and Robert Wilson have collaborated on. Kathy mentioned this to me yesterday, and I got totally fascinated. So I've been happily Googling away, and I think the portrait of Marat in his bath is that version that they recreated is pretty mesmerizing. Certainly. Anyway, I think that's all the questions we have. Just apart from, somebody did ask about what particularly set her portrait apart from the offerings at that particular salon.
I think I touched upon it a bit, in that critics saw in this work a new naturalism that had not been a feature in French portraiture up to that date. If you think about the kind of aristocratic and royal portraits that would have really dominated the salon up until the Revolution in 1789. And interestingly, as the 18th century was drawing to a close, there were an increasing number of portraits that were on view at the salon. And that number kept growing from the late 18th century into the 19th century, so much so that people were actually complaining that there were so many portraits of people that they had no idea who they were, and why did we have to look at portraits of anybody at the salon if they weren't someone important? Why bother? But I think the quality of this painting clearly set it apart, and also its naturalism was seen as something new and a new direction in French painting. And we saw that in David's portraits of the Cerisier as well, that same sense of naturalism. And again, it's something that marks a kind of a taking of a breath and being able to exhale, if you will, after all the turmoil of the revolution of 1789, the reign of terror under Robespierre of 1793-4, and great social and political instability, that things at this juncture, 1795, seem to be normalizing. And so this rise in portraiture. And also one might think rather poignantly of, if people lost lives during the reign of terror and knew people who died, that there might be a new appreciation for human life, and even a new kind of sentimentality, and wanting to capture that in portraiture.
Yes, yes. I've got yes. This is a very quick question which I probably can answer. Was why did he choose to paint on panel, and what would be the benefit of the panel over canvas? I think one of the interesting things is that in the sort of history of painting, one tends to think that early on artists, in the early Renaissance would use panel, and then somehow they moved on to canvas, which in a large way they did. But painting on panel always remained something that artists did, through the 17th and 18th century. And I think one of the reasons was that you had this very, very smooth surface where you could get very incredibly fine detail, which you couldn't perhaps achieve if you had a canvas texture. Also, to get an incredibly smooth surface on a canvas would be always open to possibly cracking as the canvas became more flexible and you had a very brittle sort of preparatory layers. So you get artists. I think the other thing was that the arrival of, for example, mahogany, as opposed to traditional things like poplar in Italy and oak in the north, meant that you could get these very, very wide planks, which didn't have any joins in them, which was also attractive. And then I think also artists discovered, also by reinventing, because they didn't really have much evidence, practice that were done early on panel paintings, like painting the back of the panel as well as the front, preparing the back, so the panel itself was completely sealed from changes in humidity, made them very, very stable, so that it was possible to have large panel paintings without the risks of cracking or movement. So I think it really was a choice of the artist for the different type of surface you could paint on.
And just to add to that, Ian, in fact, the portrait that I showed of the woman in black a la Mona Lisa, that was painted on panel, as was another portrait of around 1798 of a woman named Madame Barbier-Vauban, also, and it's at the Louvre. That's also painted on panel. So it seemed that in the sort of lead up to 1800, Gérard was interested in working on this support.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was known, for example, that panel paintings could be attacked by woodworm and things like that. But I mean, there's a very good example of a very large altarpiece at the All Souls College in Oxford, commissioned from the famous painter in his day, Anton Raphael Mengs, when he was working in Spain. And they commissioned this altarpiece, and then they suddenly realized a little bit later and sent him a letter saying, oh, please don't paint it on panel, paint it on canvas, because it will be attacked by woodworm. And Mengs wrote back and said, I'm sorry, it's too late, I've already started. And so they have this huge walnut panel, which has been half consumed by woodworm at All Souls, and has been a great conservation problem ever since. So anyway, I think that's probably, well, I think there's one question is just asking about the interest in portraiture in the US, of artists. I think there's always an interest in portrait painting. I don't know if you would say anything, Kathy.
I agree. I think sort of the ebb and flow, I think figurative painting never really died. And certainly we think about, the kind of commemorative role of portraiture, how every president gets his portrait painted. People still want to have their portraits painted. It's an interesting phenomenon. And to me, how interesting the genre is now, with artists like Kehinde Wiley, Amy Sherald, really, challenging portraiture and creating new forms of expression using portraiture. I find it all very exciting.
Good. Well, I think that's all the questions, apart from somebody asking if we should carry on and solve mysteries in other paintings. That would be wonderful. We could do that if somebody would pay us, and we could become TV stars, but I don't think that's going to happen. But anyway, this has been a wonderful collaboration between the two of us, and I'm really grateful to you for coming to Yale and really really giving us an incredible idea of the importance of our painting. And I think it's been a wonderful example of how the various strands of art history research, technical evidence and technical research can all come together and be put into this wonderful example of how mysteries can be solved in paintings with the discovery of more evidence. So thank you so much, Kathy, for that talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ian. And thank you, everybody, even though I can't see you, thank you, everybody, for coming today.
Great, thank you.